It's well known that the US government's study into UFOs, Project Blue Book, produced 13 reports. I say 13 because even though they were numbered 1 to 14, number 13 was missing. The explanation given by some linked to the government was that 13 was a quote, unlucky number. And yes, I know that governments are composed of people too, but that seems for a very logic-based, very secular, very atheistic system to be extremely unlikely. When have you ever heard, the military doesn't use 13 because it's unlucky? I haven't. Another explanation, however, that was given by those close to the government, and which seems much more plausible, is that all the information for number 13 was collected and moved into number 14. A range of reasons by ex-officers and government employees have been suggested as to why. Maybe 13 was discontinued, or found to contain insufficient information to be a full report, or was planned to be changed in name or key details, so it was wound up into 14. And for the record, this has happened in past military history, especially UFO history. We've had Project Blue Book, Project Grudge, Project Sign, and each were run by the same United States military and/or Air Force, but with widely different contents, some affirming the UFO phenomenon is real, others debunking it entirely. Another source, however, has an interesting take on this. Not only does he claim that the missing, in quotes, Blue Book 13 report existed, not only does he claim it did indeed have a name change, but he also confirms that it contained UFOs, and confirmed them as being very, very real. The Grudge Blue Book 13 report not only confirmed their identity, their reality, and possibly also confirmed their interactions with mankind as not at all positive, and out and out terrifying on occasion. And of course, we start out these terrifying interactions with yet another terrifying interaction, taking us all the way from the urban comforts of air-conditioned America to the seething jungles of Vietnam, and the amazing, contradictory life story of Bill English. In 1972, William S. English was serving as a captain in the Green Berets, when he received a mission that should have been routine. An aircraft is down, go get its crew if they're still alive, recover the information if they're not, work out what happened, destroy anything that could fall into enemy hands. Only, this was not a routine mission. At all. He and his 10-man Alpha team had to go from Vietnam into Laos to search for a B-52 bomber that had crash-landed there. The fact that America was bombing Laos was not the weird part. Although illegal by their own law, it's widely known. It was the way the bomber had gone down. It had come off worse, according to its final transmission, after being enveloped in a bright white light. And when they got there, it was just sat in the middle of the jungle. As Bill said, like a great big hand had grabbed it and just set it down. Here's what he had to say about that.
But we received our orders from MACV headquarters in Saigon, which essentially said go in, recover flight recorders, any survivors if there were any, and bring them back out. So we crossed over into the border of Laos, and it took us about 3-4 days to get there, and we found the aircraft at the coordinates which had been given us. Apparently they had been able to pinpoint its location by its locator beacon. And when we got there, initially what we found was pretty unusual, and we didn't really give it much credence or thought at that point until we started looking around. And what we found was the B-52 was completely intact. There was no visible damage, there was no cut through the jungle that looked any of that kind of stuff. And the only damage that we saw to the aircraft was where the aircraft was sitting on the underside of the fuselage. And that was from the pressure of the aircraft sitting there. The aircraft had a full load of bombs, a full load of fuel in it. And we took a very big chance in blowing one of the hatches open. And when we went into the aircraft, what we discovered was the crew, the entire crew, were still in their safety seats, still in their harnesses, and they were all dead.
Mutilated how?
We didn't know it at the time, but they were mutilated in what we now refer to as the classic sense of the word. Eyes were missing, sections of their faces were skinned completely away, and the bone was cleaned like white. It was white bone, teeth, sections of the neck and throat all the way down to the esophagus. Their tongues had been removed.
So basically reminiscent of the...
cattle mutilations, right. And there was no blood. And usually in a situation like that, you would expect to see blood all over the place.
The encounter, obviously, was deeply, deeply unsettling for English and his men. English, stoically, as per mission protocol, took photos of the scene. Then they took the dog tags of the men and buried them in temporary graves, hoping to recover them later. The flight log was taken, then the aircraft was blown up, to prevent any bombs or intelligence falling into enemy hands. He and his men were deeply disturbed over it, but they wouldn't have much longer to think about it. Nor would Bill be able to find any witnesses for us, because a few weeks later, he and his men were ambushed back in the jungles of Vietnam, and most of them were killed. Bill in turn then killed a captor, got away, got back to his lines, and spent some more time working in Vietnam, before leaving the army in 1972 or 1973. 3 years later, since he had some training in intelligence from the Special Forces, he moved to England, and was invited to become a data analyst for the RAF Chicksands military base. This base was the home of a major US Air Force NSA listening post, which was absolutely crucial during the Cold War, and may still be crucial today, which worked an entire ring of dishes that picked up signals from across Europe. He worked there, picking up signals and doing his thing, while his wife taught school and raised their 2 children. Bill often thinks back to these days fondly, remembering, "Many nights I go outside of my home, into the yard where I look up through the clear, crisp desert night, to look up at the bright stars and wonder. Sometimes I'm reminded of nights similar to these, when I stood upon the high plateau of Glastonbury Tor in England, looking at stars so bright you could almost reach out and grab a handful of them, and almost relive the legends of Camelot and Arthur the King. When I think back, I remember the pleasant times and joy that was once a part of my experiences in England with my family. As I think back on it all, I also remember the pain that was caused me during that time." He would indeed remember the pain, because one day he was given a document to review over the course of the day. It was entitled Grudge Blue Book Report 13, and the details were incredible. It was the missing Blue Book report. Not only was it the missing Blue Book report, but it contained all kinds of information on crashed UFOs, alien bodies, secret Nazi tech. He also claimed it contained photos and reports of UFOs, including from Mexico, Sweden, the United States and Canada, and information suggesting that, quote, certain people exposed to aliens were moved in the middle of the night by Air Force personnel, and relocated to various sites in the Midwest and Northwest parts of the United States. In many cases, these people experienced physical ailments from exposure to various types of radiation. It mentions one case, known as the Darlington Farm case, which supposedly took place in October 1953. According to this story, a man, his wife and their 13-year-old were sitting down at dinner. As they sat there, the lights in the farmhouse began to dim. Dogs and animals created a ruckus outside. The boy got up from the dining table to see what was going on, called his mother and father to come and look at the funny light in the sky. Then they all saw a round bowl of fire, and it began to hover over the field where the boy and the dog had run to. And the parents soon saw little men, appearing from the object, carrying the boy away, and he was never seen again. It also contains a pretty horrific report, allegedly concerning a human mutilation, in which an Air Force Sergeant E6, by the name of Jonathan Levet, was observed being taken captive, aboard what appeared to be a UFO, at the White Sands Missile Test Range in New Mexico in March 1956. It reads, Major Cunningham and Sergeant Levet were out in a field downrange from the launch sites, looking for debris from a missile test, when Sergeant Levet went over the ridge of a small sand dune and was out of sight for a time. Major Cunningham heard Sergeant Levet scream in what was described as a terror of agony. The Major, thinking Levet had been bitten by a snake or something, ran over the crest of the dune, and saw Sergeant Levet being dragged into what appeared to him, and was described as being, a silvery disc-like object, which hovered in the air approximately 15 to 20 feet. Major Cunningham described what appeared to be a long, snake-like object, which was wrapped around the sergeant's legs, and was dragging him to the craft. Major Cunningham admittedly froze as the sergeant was dragged inside, and observed the disc going up into the sky very quickly. Major Cunningham got on the Jeep radio and reported the incident to Missile Control, whereupon Missile Control confirmed a radar sighting. Search parties were dispatched into the desert to look for Sergeant Levet. Major Cunningham's report was taken, and he was admitted to the White Sands military base dispensary for observation. The search for Sergeant Levet continued for 3 more days, at the end of which his nude body was found approximately 10 miles downrange. The body had been mutilated, the tongue had been removed from the lower portion of the jaw, an incision had been made just under the lower tip of the chin, and extended all the way back to the esophagus and the larynx. He had been emasculated, and his eyes had been removed. Also, his anus had been removed, and there were comments in the report about the apparent surgical skill of the removal of these items, including the genitalia. The report contained that they'd been removed, quote, as if through a plug, which, in the case of the anus, extended all the way to the colon. There was no sign of blood within the system. The military ultimately thought that Sergeant Levet's friend had murdered him, but then, according to the report, came to the conclusion that it was indeed aliens. Even more disturbingly, the report contained gruesome black and white photographs claiming that all the birds that picked up his remains died, as well as claims that his body was entirely drained of blood. The report also claimed a number of other interesting things, such as that a so-called Recovery Team Alpha existed, to retrieve the wreckage of UFOs, and had even travelled outside the United States. English, upon viewing this report, and being asked to mark it based on its credibility, was obviously astounding. To him, it was unbelievable. To this day, he wonders if it was disinformation he was intended to spread to people. But for one key detail, the photos and videos of the B-52 incident, which he had captured himself, were within the document. So, after spending a day reviewing the document, he marked it as either 95 or 98% authentic, depending on interview, and got on with other work. And for a while, life was as usual. He remembers, "Within 2 weeks of viewing the document, things began to happen with a speed hitherto unknown in government circles. I had originally reviewed the document during the last week of June of 1977. About the second week of July, things had not changed significantly. I was still going to my medieval society meetings, taking the wife to school, and the boys to the daycare centre during the week. On weekends, Steffi and I would try to plan things together with the kids. Outings of various types, that would allow us to spend time with each other and enjoy ourselves. One of my particular favourites was taking my eldest son David into Bedfordshire on Saturdays. That was when the marketplace was full of vendors trying to sell their wares, and we would just walk and see what kind of bargains we could find. It was like an adventure to us, and then after we walked through the market, we would go to the riverside and throw bread to the swans that lived on the banks of the Bedford River. I look back on those days with a great deal of joy and sadness, as they are now gone forever to me, and I'm reminded that I have now missed the most important years of my sons' lives. And Bill would indeed miss the most important years of their lives, because what happened next was shocking. During the second week of July, he reported for work as he normally did, only this time, when he checked in, he was met by 2 Air Force security policemen, who informed him that the base commander, Colonel Robert Black, wanted to see him in his office immediately. He was then escorted to the office, where he was made to wait about 30 minutes before Black would see him. And when he did, it did not go well. Black was brusque, and informed him that his job was over, and that he was being immediately sent back to the United States via a MAC flight from RAF Lakenheath. English reminded the Colonel that since he was a civilian, and his place of hiring was in England, he had no right to ship him back to the US without consent, and that since his wife was a civilian employee of the Department of Defense schools, he would automatically fall under the dependent classification. And was Black's reaction to this good? No, it wasn't. In his own words, Black's basic reaction to all of this was laughter. He in turn politely informed me that for all I cared, he could eat SHIT and bark at the moon. I was going back to the United States, whether I wanted to or not, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Seeing that there wasn't much to be gained by arguing with this a-hole, I then requested permission to at least call my wife at the school and let her know what the hell was going on. Permission was refused me, and I was immediately escorted to RAF Lakenheath, under armed guard, and placed on a flight back to the United States. When I arrived in the States, I immediately tried to call my wife, to let her know what had happened. Every time I tried to get through, the phone would ring, a man's voice would answer, and then the phone would go dead. Not only did this happen when I tried to call my wife, but also when I tried to call several friends that could possibly get a message to my wife. Needless to say, it was like this for several months, and finally I gave up trying. I wrote letters to her, to all my friends, everyone I could think of, and since there was no response, finally I gave up trying. I have since learned that my wife transferred to a different Air Force base shortly after that, after she'd been told by Black that I'd quit my job and deserted her and the boys. It was a bald-faced lie, but by then it was too late to prove otherwise, and would have been impossible under the circumstances. English thus found himself living back in America, and his life fell apart. And, infuriatingly, that came with little tantalising hints of it coming back together, only to fall apart once again. He remembered, "What took place after that was one series of failures after another. I returned to my hometown of Tucson, Arizona, and began looking for some type of job that would support me. After several months, and much indignation, I found a job working as a fry cook and night manager at a Waffle House on I-10. It was during this time that I looked as if I might be going back to Europe, as there was a job offer to work as a cameraman. I quit my job at the Waffle House, and suddenly the job fell through. I just didn't hear anything more from them, and they wouldn't answer any of my letters of inquiry. Shortly thereafter, I got a job working for a security company as a guard. It was during this juncture in my employment career that I was assigned to work at the campus of Pima Community College. Prior to my assignment at the college, I had not given much thought to the question of UFOs, and the effect it was having on my life. In fact, I had become so consumed by the act of survival that I had not given it any thought at all. You, the reader, must bear in mind also that this was perhaps the most trying time I'd ever had in my entire life. I had just lost a family that I loved and cared for very much, and there wasn't a thing that I could do that would make it different, no matter how much I wanted to or tried. In short, I was on the verge of suicide.
And at this point, I was becoming an emotional basket case. I really was. I mean, I was an emotional wreck at that point. All kinds of things go through your head at that point, and UFOs were the furthest thing from my mind. And one of the things was that I thought that my wife was having an affair with somebody who wanted to get me out of there, and who decided that they were just going to fire me and boot me out. And eventually, as things got progressively worse, I gave up trying to contact my wife. And I haven't seen my wife or kids in 15 years.
What point did you give up? How many months into this whole scenario?
I guess it was pretty close to 2 years.
2 years.
Before I finally just said, I got to get on with my life. By this time, I had been involuntarily committed to Camino Community Hospital because at one point I tried to commit suicide.
While working the campus shift for the security company, I noticed an announcement on the bulletin board announcing the speech of one Stanford Friedman, eminent scientist and UFO investigator. The speech was set to take place at the college that night, and I decided I would attend, as I was free at the student union. During the course of Stan's speech, he imparted a great deal of information about science and the study of UFOs, but for some reason, none of it seemed to be of any great consequence. The information was based in part on investigations that many well-meaning and hard-working people have been able to gather. Most notable were the efforts of Jim and Coral Lorenzen, the founders of the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organisation. The only problem with it was the fact that it wasn't all of the information. During the course of Stan's speech, he made mention of the fact that Project Blue Book Report 13 had never been published, and that the government had said it jumped from 13 to 14 due to the unlucky significance of the number 13. Hogwash. I knew that this was hogwash, and after Stan finished his talk, I approached him and told him it was. He asked me point blank how I knew it was hogwash, and I told him that I viewed a report entitled Grudge Blue Book Report 13, and that it went far beyond their wildest dreams with regard to admitting the existence of UFOs. Within a matter of minutes, I was whisked away by Stan, Alan Benz and Jim Lorenzen to the APRO offices, that were then located on the North Country Club in Tucson, where I spent several hours relating my experience and detailing everything I could remember about the report, which was quite a bit. It took several months for the final outcome of that conversation to finally come out, but at the time, Jim Lorenzen thought I was nuttier than a fruitcake, which, I suppose, under the circumstances, was understandable. During the interim, I was allowed access to the files at the APRO offices, where I began to learn and understand more than I had before about all of this had started. One of the things I discovered through my research was that over the years, there was a pattern of government cover-up that far outreached anything that anyone was aware of, at the time I began my research. In fact, it has only been during the past 10 or so years that people have come to realise this is the case. Another thing that I discovered was the fact that the information I had concerning Grudge Blue Book Report 13 was information that someone wanted to keep quiet. So much so, in fact, that they were willing to kill, or at least put on the show of trying. And there were a lot of attempts to kill English, or at least seemed to be. He remembered, the first attempt took place in Tucson, Arizona. I was driving from Tucson to Sierra Vista, where my father has his real estate office located at. I was in the process of starting a small leather custom shop at the time, and had decided to go down to discuss with my father some problems I was having with regard to funding. As I was driving down I-10 towards Sierra Vista, it was a pleasant day, at least for riding a motorcycle. The road doesn't have much traffic, and there were several stretches where I was the only vehicle on the road. It was during one of these intervals that a black 1978 Lincoln Continental came onto the road behind me, and began to pace me as I travelled along. As I travelled, I kept seeing this car in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think a great deal of it, but as time went on, I noticed that it seemed to go faster or slower than I did, always keeping the same distance. Between Tucson and the turn-off to Huachuca City, the limo made its move, and I happened to catch it in my mirror as it suddenly sped up as it came toward me. I moved to the side of the road and began to hug the shoulder as closely as I was able to, and in the process, slowing down, in order to let it pass me by. Instead of moving toward the left to pass, it came over into the shoulder where I was at. Seeing this, and getting a bad feeling in my stomach, I gunned the motor on my bike and cut suddenly left, just barely getting out of its way as it came past me, and over the spot I had just vacated. I knew then that this wasn't an accident. Just after the car passed me by, the driver slammed on the brakes and spun round, in order to make another pass at me. For a few moments, it seemed like I was in the middle of a game of rollerball, and I was the ball. Avoiding the vehicle again, I then cut across into the desert as fast as I could go. The Lincoln tried to follow, but as it came out onto the desert floor, it appeared to get stuck in the loose dirt and stopped. I continued on my way through the desert in the general direction towards Sierra Vista, and eventually made my way to my father's office. When I arrived at my father's, I told him what had taken place. He pooh-poohed and told me that it was my imagination, but nevertheless, followed me in his car back to Tucson. This was the first attempt on my life. But English is not left alone there. Oh no, then we have attempt number 2. Within a matter of weeks, another attempt took place. By this time, I had gotten my business operating, and did a lot of work in my apartment. I had gotten into a pattern by this time, and was usually in bed around 10 o'clock at night. That night, however, I had been invited to spend the night to friends, whom I had been helping to rebuild a saddle. It came just at the spur of the moment, and I had not made any plans for it to happen prior. This particular night, I just happened to be at the store when he came over and asked me to come by and have dinner, in exchange for the work I had been helping him with on the saddle, and then stay for an evening of movies. Normally, I would have been at home that particular night. The next morning, upon my return to my apartment, I found it had been firebombed completely. The fire department informed me it had been arson. It would seem that someone tossed a firebomb into my front window, possibly thinking I would be there. I lost everything I had in the apartment, to include a pet hamster I'd grown quite attached to. Over the years, there have been approximately 15 attempts on my life. Several of these were reported to the local police department, several were not. In all cases, the police department have not investigated once they found out that I am an investigator of the UFO phenomenon. You figure it out. And we begin to figure out a lot more, because guess who shows up again? In the early part of 1980, I was surprised to receive a phone call from Robert Black, the Air Force colonel who, in 1977, sent me packing on my way back from RAF Chicksands. Black told me that he had been involuntarily retired from the Air Force, and believed it was in part due to the document that I had viewed while working for Security Services Commander RAF Chicksands. I was more or less cool toward Black, but agreed to meet with him at my store in Trail Dust Town in Tucson. When we met, I asked him several questions concerning my family, and discovered what had happened after my departure. According to Black, she finished out the school year at RAF Chicksands, and then requested, and received, a transfer to a different school within the Department of Defence schools in Great Britain. He went on to say that he had no idea what happened after I tried to contact them, saying that he was told after I left that it was out of his hands. Black went on to say that he had come across some information that indicated a flying saucer, or space vehicle of some type, had crashed at the White Sands missile range, and that because of its size, they were unable to move it, so instead buried it where it lay. He wanted to know if I was interested in coming with him to find it. I asked him why me, and he said that because I'd read the document and knew what we were looking for. He went on to say also that he was putting every bit of money that he had into outfitting a special vehicle that would carry equipment and supplies, but that he didn't have enough. By this time, I was thoroughly hooked on the idea, and made an agreement with him to sell my business, and then put most of the money I'd made into the vehicle also, which is what I did. In the meantime, I contacted Wendell Stevens, and told him of what we were planning, and invited him along. He was in the middle of investigating the Billy Meyer case in Switzerland, and declined. His decision to not participate is most likely what saved his life. And boy, 'cause Stevens' life sure as hell was saved. English met with Black at Belen, New Mexico. Along with Black was his former operations sergeant at RAF Chicksands, whose name English has somehow forgotten. Black explained that the sergeant had also been involuntarily retired from service, and that he had also lost his family. They proceeded northward toward Belen, going towards Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and then crossed over easterly toward the Trinity test site, where the first atomic bomb was tested. From the Trinity test site, they then proceeded southerly to Alamogordo, and over past Holloman Air Force Base, and then, via the White Sands National Monument, broke into the White Sands missile range. Of course, as you can imagine, the military did not appreciate a random van shining its headlights in the middle of the desert, intruding on its territory. English was walking about 500 to 1,000 miles in front of the van with a metal detector, trying to see if there was anything buried under the sand, in the light of the headlights, and as he was walking, he heard a sound that made his skin crawl, the sound of an incoming rocket. The van was entirely destroyed, and Black and his staff sergeant were killed. English, however, concealed himself, seeing incoming halos disgorging soldiers, and then, in his own words, "I had on my web belt, and a canteen full of water, and my survival knife, so I essentially had everything I needed to survive in the desert. I travelled northwesterly through the desert at night, for about 2 days, before I came to a major road and was able to throw a ride into Tucson from New Mexico. When I arrived in Tucson, it was in the early morning hours, and I made my way to Wendell Stevens' home, where I woke him up by knocking on his bedroom window. Being the good egg that he is, he let me into his home, and gave me some food, the use of his shower and a shirt. The pants were too small. After I had refreshed myself, I related to him everything that had happened and taken place during the past several days, while he recorded it with his recorder and took notes. I have since learned that the original tapes have disappeared. After several hours of talking with Wendell, I pretty much told him everything that I could, and he was kind enough to give me a ride home from his place. As we approached the apartment, where I was then living with a lady friend, I spotted a large black car parked in front of the building. I asked Wendell to drive around the corner from the apartment, and drop me off. Making my way back to the apartment, I let myself in through the back door, and then quietly looked out the front of the window, to see somebody sitting inside the vehicle, smoking a cigarette. They, whoever they were watching for me. It was time to leave, and go into hiding. And English did indeed go into hiding, abandoning his girlfriend without a second thought, remembering what had happened with his wife, and feeling that for her own protection, it would be best. He took his stuff, sold it to a local thrift store, and then moved to a small trailer on the west side of town. He stayed there for about a month, then went to Phoenix, Arizona, where he made sure he was arrested in the bus station by a Phoenix police officer on an old traffic ticket. When he arrived at the holding cell at the Phoenix Police Department, he called his sister, and had her drive to Phoenix to pick him up, and pay the fines with money he'd left her for this purpose. She then drove him back to Tucson, where he spent the night at her home. 3 weeks later, he was in Los Angeles, in a homeless shelter, and from there he was told to check out the Hudson House, which he then went to, one block down from Grauman's Theatre and the heart of Hollywood, and agreeing to work a job to be given a home there. And then something interesting happened. As he sat there, filling out the paperwork, he came across a form that at first seemed innocuous, until he looked at the bottom of it, printed there with the letters GBS, meaning gay, bisexual or straight. He didn't think anything more of it at that moment, thinking it was California and people who lived there were a bit different to begin with, so he circled S, since he was neither of the first two. In his own words, "When I circled S, Bob got a funny look on his face and started to hem and ha a little bit. Finally, he looked at me and said there was a problem." "Oh?" says I. "What kind of problem?" And Bob says, "The Hudson House is a halfway house for gays." Okay, I think to myself. I must have turned white or something, because Bob tried to be as nice as he could, and you have to bear in mind that all of this took place within a matter of milliseconds. Thinking fast, I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I don't have a problem with that if you don't." After several minutes of discussion with Bob, I assured him I had nothing against gays, and would respect them and their lifestyle if they accorded me the same respect. Besides, I told him, I needed a place to live, and more or less get my collective S-word together, and currently, this was the best offer in town. After making a few phone calls to the administrators of the operation, he agreed to give it a try for a while to see how things went. I could write a book about the following 3 months. It was an experience that I shall never forget, and believe it or not, one that I shall remember with a certain amount of fondness. I learned a great deal, and many of those lessons have helped me considerably since then. I will say this, however. There is nothing stranger than to have a gay in love with another gay come to you and ask about what he, or for that matter she, should do to win over the other. By the time I left, they were referring to me as Papa Bear, the Ann Landers of the gay world. What a distinction! I lived at the Hudson House in LA for about 3 months, during which time I did my 2 weeks of service, and was then allowed to go out and seek employment. Using the services provided by the organisation, I found a job working at a restaurant that was owned, operated, and frequented by gays in the local community, as a fry cook, for $5 an hour. It wasn't the greatest paying job in the world, but it allowed me the opportunity to support myself, and at the same time, save enough money to begin phase 2 of my now established plan. I must admit that being more or less an observer of life, I enjoyed the real life drama that was taking place around me. One of these days, if I ever get to the point where I can stop being a UFO investigator, I might sit down and write several books about these incidents. In many respects, I doubt seriously that you could go through much of that without splitting your sides in laughter. At the end of the 3 months, I had managed to save enough money to begin phase 2, which was to leave California without notice and head eastward to the farm my mother had bought several years previously in Virginia, and where she had recently moved when she and my stepfather had retired. During the second week in November, just after I got my paycheck from the restaurant, I informed the managers I was quitting without notice. I then went back to the Hudson House and packed my bags, telling everyone I had to return to Arizona for an emergency in the family, and walked to the bus station, where I then caught a bus for Virginia. During the next 8 years, I spent a fairly quiet life. The first year, I lived on my mother's farm, working and helping her and my dad to remodel the farmhouse. During this period, my stepfather was forced to return to work in Saudi Arabia as a construction engineer on a project there. I personally think it was because my mother was turning him into a lunatic, but in any case, I spent most of the year alone, with what at the time appeared to be a mad woman of Chalet, or something like that. In any case, she made me slightly crazy. After about a year, she and I more or less got tired of each other, and one day, I told her that I didn't think I would make a very good farmer. Her reply to that was, "Okay, don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out." I left that day, and moved into Lynchburg, Virginia, which was the closest town to the farm, and as it happened, was the home of Liberty University and Jerry Falwell, whom I later came to victimise on a fairly frequent basis when I went to late-night radio. During the next few years, I quietly disassociated myself from UFOs and research into that field, eventually divorcing my wife and marrying a second time. The marriage lasted about 3 months, and ended rather nastily when she awoke one morning to inform me she was pregnant, and she didn't want to be, and that I was a royal pain in the ass, and that she didn't want to be married anymore. Not a real confidence booster. Especially in light of the fact that we had dated each other for the better part of a year and a half before I asked her to marry me, and we discussed the fact that I couldn't handle a second loss of this nature. Needless to say, I more or less fell apart at the seams for a while, and went on a 6-month tour that would have made WC Fields proud. Eventually, however, I did get my SHIT back together again. By this time, I was working at a local radio station in Crewe, Virginia, and writing articles for the locally weekly newspaper. By this point, his ex-wife had the baby, tried to get him for child support, and, amazingly, English won in the court battle, since she'd divorced him, and thus didn't have to pay child support. During the 2 years that he lived in Crewe, things were more or less quiet, with the exception of one incident. One night, he was at home watching the television and had gotten up to get a soda from the kitchen. When he came back into the living room, he tripped over his shoelaces, of all things, and face-planted the floor. And then bullets began face-planting the building. The whole house. The gunfire went on for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality was only a few minutes. The local sheriff and state police, however, stated that at least several thousand rounds were emptied into the front of the home. One account says 2,000, the other says 15. Due to the construction of the home, a concrete foundation wall about 3 feet high is what apparently saved his life. The first thing the law enforcement agencies thought was that it might be something my ex-father-in-law had decided to do, since I was not budging an inch on the child support thing, and he had the reputation for being slightly radical when it came to his daughters.
15,000 rounds.
So obviously this case was investigated.
Oh yeah, it was investigated, and they thought initially that it was my father-in-law, who was ex-Army officer, who decided that he was going to settle a score with me that I had no idea was going on, other than the fact that...
Having to do with the wife.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But they never were able to pin it on...
They weren't able to pin it on anyone, really, and they just sort of left it as an unsolved case. Of course, I was working for a radio station at the time, and I was a public figure in a local community, and I had a fairly controversial show.
Okay, so it's possible then that in that particular case, for instance...
In that particular case, it could have been anything or anyone.
Some maniac gun.
Yeah.
And to this day, Bill wonders if it was non-UFO related. Still, not taking his chances, he obviously decided to take off and left for Blackstone, Virginia. After an injury working on a ranch, he went to work for his mom's new pig farm, and found himself shoveling pig crap for 6 months by hand, and he claims, quote, "The only good thing that came out of that was I met my third and present wife, and had the cleanest sinuses I've had in 38 years. Meeting said second wife during radio work in Blockdale, Virginia, and continuing to do said work for a while, until one day he began to receive some rather cryptic messages from his father, telling him that some, quote, a-hole was pestering the hell out of him, and that he'd better do something about it. Said a-hole was John Lear, veteran UFO researcher. Bill wasn't really keen to get back into ufology, so he didn't pay this much heed, but he did get back into contact with Wendell Stevens, and found out, to his amazement, that he had a prominent part in a recent book published by Bill Steinman and himself. He read the book, claimed it substantiated everything he'd been saying all along, so decided to contact Lear. In a little bit of cleverness, when he called Lear, he represented himself as Bill English's lawyer, saying he was overseas, and had been asked to contact him and find out what he wanted. John wanted to know about Grudge 13, and a few days later, they met up, and then Bill moved back to Alamogordo, New Mexico, not only the place he'd been born, but the last place he visited when he was actively investigating UFOs before his disappearance, then founding UFINET, UFINET, UFO News and Information Service. Bill, these days generally reclusive, finds it hard to believe that if the government wanted him dead, they would have failed in their efforts. In his own words, this leaves open several possibilities. The first and most unlikely being that they are complete incompetence, and the second being that the efforts are an attempt to motivate me in certain directions. He also still wonders if the report he'd seen wasn't disinformation, despite his initial opinion that it was 95 or 98% accurate. In spite of a falling out with Bill Cooper, because Cooper, of course he did, published a lie that claimed that Bill had been shot after the 1989 MUFON convention that they attended together, Bill does seem to still have a casual interest in UFOs, albeit from the shadows. So what are we to make of Bill English's story? Well, I think we should dissect it piece by piece, starting with English's supposed military service in the very non-English, very Murica-style 60s and 70s American Army, particularly in Vietnam and England. Here are some of Bill's claims about how his military service began.
When I was about 17 years old, I joined the United States Army. Went through basic training at Fort Bliss in Texas, which is about 80 miles away from where I'm at now. And when I completed basic training, I was supposed to become an aircraft mechanic, and was temporarily stationed at Fort Rucker, Alabama, where the Army Aviation Maintenance School was located at, and waited there for several weeks. Went through a flight physical and told that I was colorblind. And I hadn't realized it at the time, but I had a guaranteed enlistment. So I could have gotten out of the Army then, and if I'd had any sense, I probably should have, but I didn't. And I was sent over to Army recruitment office to change my MOS. And first thing, of course, he did was tear up my guarantee and enlistment card, and then very directly tell me where I was going and what I would do. And you'd think at the time that they would have just dropped me into infantry and left it at that, but they didn't. They sent me to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland to become a 45 Bravo 20, which is a small arms repairman. And then, oddly enough, from there, they sent me to Fort Benning, Georgia, to airborne school. And from airborne school, they sent me to Fort Polk, Louisiana, where I began training in special operations, which is kind of weird because at the same time I transferred, I went straight from private 0 to Sergeant E5. And back in those days, you couldn't get into Special Forces unless you were an E5 or above. You know, I found that I enjoyed the work. I might mention at this point that I did not graduate from high school at that time. And while I was in basic training, I was offered officers candidate school until they discovered that I was not a high school graduate. And it occurred to me then that it would probably be a good idea to get my high school diploma, which I did. And you got to remember, this is over 45, almost 50 years ago. And I was sent from Fort Polk, Louisiana to Jungle Operations Training Course, 8 Special Forces in Panama. And then from Panama, I was sent to Southeast Asia, 5th Corps Special Forces, 5th and the 7th, where I worked as a striker, which essentially is a sharpshooter. On 2 occasions, I received a battlefield commission to first lieutenant and then to captain. And from there, I did various and sundry assignments, some of which we won't talk about. But
so, Bill claims he joined US government service at 17, just like Phil Schneider, and trained in Texas. Once basic training was done, he was supposed to be an aircraft mechanic and got sent to Fort Wrecker, Alabama, but instead, upon finding out he was colourblind, was sent over to an Army recruitment office, and he was sent over to Aberdeen Proving Ground to become a small arms repairman, then Fort Benning, Georgia, to airborne school, then to Louisiana, where he began training in special operations, which he himself admits was, quote, kinda weird, because he went from, quote, straight from Private 0 to Sergeant E5, and back in those days, you couldn't get into special forces unless you were E5 or above. Very interesting for a 17-year-old with no high school diploma who couldn't become an officer for that very reason, but who claims he was sent to the 8th Special Forces Jungle Operations Corps, then to Southeast Asia, working as a sharpshooter, promoted to first lieutenant, then to doing captain work, doing assignments, quote, some of which we won't talk about, in very classic Steven Seagal fashion. Not only was he very, very young to have been in the Green Berets, but then we get to his military record. His 201 files show he was in the army, but he was a telephone technician with the rank of Spec 4 or Corporal. He did go to jungle training camp, he attempted to, but he didn't pass it. Remember that Bill has claimed the following.
My clearance at the time was what they call a Crypto 14. 13 or 14, I believe it was. Which essentially meant my clearance was higher than the president's clearance as far as material and information.
Is that possible?
Well, when you consider every 4 years you got this redneck who comes into the office from Texas or Georgia or California or wherever, and considering the sometimes the quality of the presidential candidates, what would you think?
That's the way I would do it. That is the way I would do it. I've often thought about that, but there are people out there who will scoff at that.
Well, I don't think the American public realizes just how limited the president's powers really are. Presidential office is realistically vacated every 4 years. Mm-hmm. Now, you have a person who will sit in office for 4 years and who literally has his finger on the button. But he's not really doing the job of government. You've got your agencies like the CIA, the DIA, MSI, and then your Labor Department and all those things that are doing the real work of the matter.
So, a guy only proven to have a telephone technician rank was able to access information higher than the president. And not only that, but he's always bragging of his photographic memory and quoted in painstaking detail the alleged contents of the Grudge 13 report, but notice how his memory interestingly fades sometimes.
The reason I ask that is because you seem to recall a lot of details about the document. You have the serial number J1327 Delta, inside a publication with red tape, code red security precautions, title analysis report. I mean, you seem to have the whole thing pretty much committed to memory. Did you do that on purpose?
No, I have a pretty phenomenal memory to a certain extent, and that information at that time was pretty fresh in my mind. Basically, from memory, I returned to the United States the first week of June, and first week of August, and the date I actually viewed the document was June the 27th, not July the 27th, and I was back in the States about the middle of July. Okay. And August, September, I guess it was about September.
That's actually a very high percentage. Is that just your talent?
I have an idyllic memory.
Okay. Your what? Your what?
I have an idyllic memory.
Idyllic. All right, yeah. I got it, but I can't say it.
Not only all this, he can't remember the number of his A-team, he can't remember the name of Colonel Black's staff sergeant, who he went on a literal top-secret helicopter rocket bomb mission with, and furthermore, according to more than one website, including a literal alien conspiracy one, quote, could not remember details from the crash. He could not remember the tail number of the B-52, the number of his A-team, or recognise the CAR-15, the preferred weapon of Special Forces personnel. And one site, in the biggest amount of copium I've ever seen, has put it down to his memory being altered to discredit him. He also claims he has either, quote, level 13 or 14 security clearance, higher than the president, but can't exactly remember which level. You can't exactly remember which level of top secret US government security clearance you had for 4 years. If you marked a secret, mind-blowing, mind-boggling report on UFOs as 95% accurate or 98. Then we get to the fact that England has no record of any deportation of a William s.english ever taking place in 1976. And that James W. Johnson Jr. was commander of RAF Chicksands in 1976, not Colonel Robert Black. And then there's no proof Bill was ever in Vietnam, and also no proof he was even remotely near the Green Berets. His military record shows he did attend a jungle training camp in Germany, but not much else, and he claims in his defence, quote, it's true that there are a couple of stolen valor sites that have claimed I was a phony. However, none of these sites have posted my reply to them, or the fact that there were glaring discrepancies to my 201 files, which I gave them permission to obtain. The biggest is that I attended jungle operations training course in Germany, especially since JOTC was taught in Panama at the School of the Americas, operated by the 8th Special Forces Group. Nor do they mention the fact that I was able to present witnesses and their DD-214s that verified my assignments to both the 8th Group and the 5th Group. And I admit that records can be altered and changed, but given what we see of English's demonstrated knowledge, it's not very likely. Nor is there any record of Colonel Robert Black ever being a real person, nor his staff sergeant, who English forgets the name of in his original online posting, then suddenly identifies as Horn out of the blue, then doesn't blow the horn to provide any further information. And I wonder why he also provides no further information on the fact that B-52s didn't have tracking beacons back then. And in some stories, he leaves Vietnam in 1972, in others 1971, in some others 1973.
I left Vietnam in 1971.
Now, let's get into the details of Bill's story. Remember, he lands on the ground and finds the B-52. The B-52 that, in spite of quoting painstaking Project Grudge details, he can't remember the tail number of, and in spite of the fact that all B-52s in creation are accounted for. He then, despite it having a fully loaded bomb load, decides to blow open the hatch. Why not just open it? The Green Berets have the means to do that. Then he takes the photos, blah blah blah, and then how convenient it is that just after, his entire squad is ambushed, all but one dies, and he manages to kill a Viet Cong with his bare hands and run off into the jungle. These stories of individual, mind-numbing bravery are a constant theme in Bill's stories. Almost like he likes people seeing him as a heroic crusader, the center of attention. And then we get to the story itself. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop now. Bill English's account of the crashed B-52 sounds very similar to an account of a B-52 crash by one Sergeant Clifford Stone, a very, very credible man who claims he was part of a UFO crash retrieval team. Stone said, about an alleged incident in Vietnam, "We got to a place where we found a B-52, plug full of holes by what appeared to be a close air burst, or perhaps a collision with a, what we call, SAM missile. That's surfaced air missile. That's what SAM stands for. It's an acronym. The unusual aspect of it was, it appeared like some big giant hand plucked it out of the sky and set it down there on the jungle floor. When you have a plane coming in to crash, if it noses down and crashes, you got billions of pieces. It's not one whole craft, or essentially intact. If it comes down at an angle, the trees where it hits, they are severed at the top up to the point where it impacts them. You have all kinds of pieces on the jungle floor. This was in whole as though it was just set down, like there was some child's toy." I love how he explains that a surface-to-air missile is a surfaced-air missile. And I also love how he's like, surfaced-air missile, that's what SAM stands for. It's an acronym. Very elite. Yeah, I was special forces. Yeah, like commandos and shit. I can't. But his story gets even crazier. Last time I do this voice, I promise. "When I saw this craft, I was taken aback, and I was curious, probably more so than the others. I went around looking at the craft, and we were looking straight in on the craft. I went around looking at the craft, lots of crafting, not really crafting in my head of where I was at, or thinking about running into anything and shit. When I got around to the other side, I was taken aback when all of a sudden I heard, like, in my head, but like we were talking, a voice said, 'Clifford, what are you doing here? Why are you here?' And I looked up, and I was startled. For a lack of better terms, and the only way I could describe it, is that these entities looked like your typical greys, 3.5 to 4 feet tall." And his collaborator, ghostwriter, Joseph Zaromsky, said this, "I'm definitely not Clifford. He saw greys on the other side of the plane, and they asked him why he was there. He heard it in his head. Apparently they were startled to see him. There was shooting going on all around him, but they were able to stop the bullets. They said to me, they said to him, they had the technology to be able to stop time. So he told them, if you can stop time, you need to get out of the way, or you're gonna be killed. Oh yeah, Rambo shit." So Bill English's bomber story sounds exactly like the story of the other dude with wacky claims, only the other dude with wacky claims added on grey aliens, his personal heroic gunfight with grey aliens, Star Wars stuff, and Jedi powers. They can stop time. I can't, guys, I just can't. I know people say I shouldn't be scornful, but I just can't. And then we get to the RAF Chicksans thing. For the record, I do believe that his wife probably... No, I'm not going to. I do believe that his wife probably taught school there. And I don't think, especially since their kids do exist, that's a thing you can just make up, since real human beings are involved, and their names have been mentioned, and his divorce filings are real. I think they had some military connections they exploited via his service, and boom. Literally. However, I find his claim to have been an analyst there very interesting. Note how he says he was a civilian contractor, not military, working for the NSA. Not only very interesting because there's no evidence he ever had training in intelligence, but also it's very convenient because there are no military records of him working there, nor being deported, so he can say, as he does, "Oh wait, I was technically a civilian, not a military man, so there would be no record." I swear I'm going to stop now. Plus, he claims he got the job because an old officer he knew, who he of course doesn't name, approached him in the officers club and said, "Oh hey, why don't you go work for RAF Chicksans?" Something tells me it doesn't work like that. Another thing I find interesting is that by his own admission, his wife was working there before he got the job, a month prior, and he was, officially, by his own admission, all throughout these years, listed as her dependent. In other words, someone who wasn't working and was financially dependent on his wife. Notice how he has a lot of time during the day. Dropping his wife off at work, going to medieval society, taking care of the kids. It's almost like he, I don't know, doesn't work. And that's up to the military informing his wife that he's up and left, and the fact that there's no military record of him being deported, let alone working there, and one wonders if he, a stay-at-home dad who later made up working for the NSA, did just up and leave. And then we get to what happened after Grudge. Colonel Robert Black, a very fictitious-seeming persona, dismisses him and flies him home, not letting him see his wife first. This is in spite of the fact that this dismissal was very clearly illegal, since English wasn't a military man, but was NSA, and he could have tried harder to challenge it, but English just said there was, quote, "no point arguing," and just went with it, not even calling his wife. And when he got back, he tried calling her for a few months, or years, depending on the story, and then after this he just gives up.
I thought that my wife was having an affair with somebody who wanted to get me out of there and who decided that they were just going to fire me and boot me out. And that was a reasonable explanation at the time. I didn't know what else to think because I certainly wasn't thinking about UFOs or the job that I was doing. I wasn't told that the job I did was poor or anything. In fact, I had received several commendations for the work that I did. And
nobody ever mentioned to you that you were being shipped out because you had seen this stuff?
No.
So that never occurred to you?
It never occurred to me at that point. And eventually, as things got progressively worse, I gave up trying to contact my wife. And I haven't seen my wife or kids in 15 years.
It took me several months after my return to the United States to finally determine what had happened. I was not allowed to say goodbye to my wife or children who remained in England, who remained at RAF Chicksans for another 5 years, where she taught school at the RAF Chicksans Dependent School. I have not seen my wife and sons in 12 years. I have not heard from them in 2 years.
No flying out to see her, no frantically getting a fake passport, just giving up. Dude, this is your wife and family, supposedly beloved to you. Why didn't you just dive on the first plane? Why didn't you get a fake passport? He wasn't barred from coming to England, and he still had his passport and final paycheck. Why not do it? I would have done. Plus, note how his reasoning changes. It wasn't long before I realised this was to do with Grudge 13. I thought my wife was having an affair. And then not seeing them for 15 years afterwards? Very interesting. And then, in classic Phil Schneider style, he glosses over the fact that he was in a mental hospital. Very interesting. I'm sure being in a mental hospital has nothing to do with his off-vibing interviews, nor his fantastic UFO claims. Then note how, when he's on the verge of suicide, working as a security guard, minus family and extremely unfulfilled in his life, what should he do but come across a fascinating, incredible, out-of-this-world lecture on UFOs, and then suddenly walk up to the dude giving it and say, "Wait, I saw Grudge 13," suddenly turning himself into a person of incredible significance and filling the void in his mind-numbingly empty life. And then we get to the whole Colonel Black incident thing. Mr. No records exist for him, Colonel Black turns up out of nowhere, as does Sergeant No Name / Sergeant Horn, and they go on a crusade to Mordor to find the giant buried UFO, and the helo appears and blows up the van, and the special forces are dropped from the other helos. But despite the fact that these are heat-seeking missiles, and despite the fact that headlights are illuminating him in the middle of the desert, not only does he escape the choppers, not only does he escape the soldiers, not only does he run away across the desert with no cover, but he escapes the highly secure, highly helicopter-patrolled White Sands without being killed. Somehow evades government spies watching the house by going into that same house, abandoning another woman and going on the run, can't get Wendell Stevens to back up his accounts because the tapes have conveniently disappeared, and ends up living in a homeless shelter for gay men. I find this part very interesting. Bill's wife is told by the base he's up to left her, he leaves another woman, he doesn't see his children for quite a number of years, possibly doesn't even see his other child. The interviewer and multiple other people speculate a ulterior motive for him leaving.
I'm sure you're aware there's speculation is that this whole thing was confabulated by you as some kind of an excuse or a kind of a defense against
desertion and marital problems and stuff like that. Yeah, well, I understand that, and I'm very familiar with that. And yes, it could be a possibility, but it's not.
And he ends up living in a homeless shelter for gay men, getting out, having another failed marriage and attempting to start a family, becoming an alcoholic. I believe in being fair to everyone, but Bill, this isn't a good look for you.
I have been called a liar. I have been called a drug addict, a pervert, a psychotic, you name it, and I've been called it. According to some, I am probably the most perverted son of a bitch you will meet in the entire world. At that time, being fairly conservative and not as liberal as I am these days, I expressed the opinion that I thought Mr. Schultz was a bit different. I told Mr. Chandra that I wanted a piece of Mr. Moore's ass so bad I was ready to crawl through the phone and bite him on the ear.
I'm not going to question anything, especially since he's constantly affirming in all his stories how straight he is, and in his speeches how he's not, in his own words, a pervert. But all I'm going to say is that looking at all the chaos here, the divorcing your wife after not even trying to physically find her, the second pregnant wife suddenly, quote, walking out on you, the alcoholism, the involuntary insane asylum, the strange body language and blank tone, some might question the orientation of your life. I'm not going to question anything, but I am going to play this video of Trump dancing. The muted, unnamed song accompanying it will be played in your head, and if you can hear it, it might be quite a fitting one for this case. Which, of course, brings us to the biggest so-called assassination attempt, the one with the machine guns. Bill himself has stated he has a hard time believing that if the government wanted him dead, he wouldn't be dead by now. He stated his ex-father-in-law, ex-military, has, quote, radical views about his daughters, is admittedly slightly annoyed at how Bill disappeared into the ether, leaving 2 kids behind, or is that the marriage of the one kid? This is quite messy, and he was a fiery radio host constantly stirring up trouble, and has admitted it could have been a crazy person, someone annoyed with him going after Liberty University or something like that, and if the government is going to kill someone, we can imagine they might be a little more subtle about it. He's claimed he's been shot, stabbed, got food poisoning, been driven off of the road, been blown up. Now, much as with Phil Schneider, if you take all these statements on face value, they do look very incriminating. But the shooting can be accounted for, being stabbed, well, trust me, I live in England, that can happen to anyone. Getting food poisoning, really? And a lot of us get driven off the road. The being blown up thing comes from a fuel tank in his garden exploding, as seen in this clip.
The tank had just been installed. It had just been tested by the butane company, and it had been certified as being secure. And when it exploded, it took out my car, 2 storage sheds, and burnt the living hell out of the front lawn.
And he's also claimed there have been a whole host of others he hasn't even reported, meaning, obviously, they can be made up and there's no evidence for their existence. It seems like he likes to curiously fence it, claiming at one moment the documents could have been disinformation designed to point him in one direction, then in another that the government must be trying to erase him, which by now they surely would have done, as he's himself admitted.
Okay, but bottom line, you think that most of these attempts have been, what, signals to you?
Either an attempt to silence me or to motivate me into certain directions, I believe.
By whom?
I don't know.
Speculate.
The government.
Okay. Then that leads to the next question. Wouldn't it behoove them more to just leave you alone? and not attract attention, not get your mind going in the direction of, hey, I may be onto something because somebody's trying to kill me.
Unless, of course, they want me to go into a certain direction and do certain things.
It's a hell of a way to tell you.
Well, when I'm left alone, at this point in recent years, I haven't gotten involved in UFOs. In fact, when I was in Virginia, I wanted absolutely nothing to do with them.
Furthermore, Bill, by his own admission, told his oldest son that all the UFO stuff was bullshit. He told him it was all bullshit. His own son.
And it's just been recently that my oldest son and I have started talking to each other. You know, and he asked me specifically, what about this UFO stuff? And I told him flat out, I said, it's all bullshit. Every bit of it's bullshit.
I'm just guessing, but you said that in an effort to mend fences, that the fact that you had undergone that, seen all that, was basically irrelevant compared to the importance of mending fences with your son.
Yeah, exactly.
By his own admission, he lied, and he also pretended to be his own lawyer when he talked to John Lear, and that doesn't even take into account the other allegations of lying. Bill Moore has claimed Bill English told him he and Mr. Schultz, who was, quote, different, were taking LSD at the time he came up with the Grudge 13 report.
Bill English told me that he and Jerry Schultz were doing LSD when they wrote the Blue Book summation. This is a documented fact. Bill did in fact say this, and I have a letter from him stating that he said it. And I have that letter here today. It's in the possession of Mr. John Lear because I gave it to him yesterday morning. That statement is an out-and-out lie. I never made such a statement to Mr. Moore. In fact, I do not do drugs. I have a hard time taking drugs, even those prescribed by the doctor.
Bill has had to refute claims of being a drug addict, he's been an alcoholic, and Bill is clearly a person with an axe to grind. Listen to his 1989 MUFON speech. Now endlessly he repeats, I'm not a paranoiac, I'm not a schizophrenic, I'm not a pervert. It's almost as if he's covering for something, or trying to get his audience to believe something. These claims he makes are exactly like the fantastic claims of Phil Schneider, and exactly like the fantastic claims of Bill Cooper, the only difference being that Cooper and Schneider were more full of frenzied hyperbole. And plus, why on earth would a mentally unstable guy be given level 13 or 14 security clearance, higher than the president, and not even be able to remember his clearance level? As I've said before, if I'd been given a top secret clearance level, I would remember everything. So what do I think happened in this case? This is my theory, based on the evidence at hand. William English was a mentally unstable, restless kind of person in life, constantly tormented by his own mind, unable to stay in place for long, troubled by his upbringing and maybe lack of parental warmth, and constantly trying to find something, anything, to medicate himself, as seen by his alcoholism, chain smoking and coughing in videos, anything to feel whole. He bounced from job to job and marriage to marriage, always trying to make things work and always failing. He was in the military, but jumped out before he achieved his dream of being special forces, before he did any jumps at all, simply because he couldn't handle anything and was a drifter. His wife then got the military job, but he abandoned her and the children, using his pre-existing interest in UFOs as an excuse, which came into his head and fully bloomed once he'd met Stan Friedman. He then attached himself to the UFO world to feel whole, but the drama and chaos that surrounded him joined him there. To compound all this, the very right-wing Bill was maybe struggling with his sexuality and identity, unable to reconcile his beliefs with who he was, and when you mix all this together, you get a very toxic stew. A very fascinating, very compelling, but ultimately very toxic stew. I don't know why he needed to lie. His own life, even when you look at all the true verifiable parts, is so fascinating as to beg a belief. The other possibility is that he did work these jobs, or some of them, but much as with Bill Cooper, he saw disinformation that the government was either using to test him, or use him as a conduit to spread disinformation to the outside world, as he himself has speculated. Maybe he failed the test, was arrogantly dismissed from the NSA, and had an axe to grind. Notice how Bill Cooper also claims to have been shown the Grudge 13 papers, and when we remember how similar Bill Cooper's story is, how he was also a lying, unstable alcoholic, and how the government has a tendency to Paul Bennewitz style give out disinformation, it does make you think. The third possibility is that Bill English is a conduit for disinformation willingly. That is, he is a disinformation agent. Note the shadiness, and also note that when Bill Moore got up at the 1989 MUFON conference and gave his famous mea culpa, lots of people were shouting and yelling, desperate to drown him out. And that, according to many reports, one of the loudest was Bill English, striding around at the back trying to find a fire hose to prevent Moore speaking.
Last night, Mr. Moore stood up here and said, we must stop the character assassination. We must stop the infighting. We must stop the disinformation. And as he was saying that, I was walking around the back of this auditorium about ready to pop a cork because the man was standing there telling you a bald-faced lie.
Was he genuinely outraged or on assignment? Furthermore, remember, he approached Stanton Friedman, who was getting close, many people believe, to the Roswell truth, out of nowhere, stated he'd seen Grudge 13, and then, some might say exactly as planned, he was taken back to the APRO offices, and then he was given access to their archive. Almost as if he asked for it, almost as if that was part of the plan all along. But what do you guys think? Do you think Bill English is legit? Do you think he's partially legit? Do you think he's an absolute liar? Please post that in the comment section below, and if you're Bill, please chime in. And do not forget to like and share this video, subscribe and hit the bell notification button, and suggest my channel to anyone you might think might find it interesting. Thank you for 600 plus subscribers so far. And with that, so concludes another episode of Dorsacast. Stay tuned for the next one.